how he went from being this very technical man to being so interested in the Giza pyramid, and he's going to tell us all about it. Christopher, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello, hello. Welcome to P101.
Oh, nice to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very nice introduction.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Christopher, not only did you write this book, but you have another book coming out very soon as well, right?
Yes, actually, it went to the printers on Friday. So I'm very, very excited about that. It's entitled Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, Advanced Engineering in the Pyramids and Temples of the Pharaohs.
Ooh.
And this book picks up on a subject in the Giza power plant that I consider to be the underpinning of considering the ancient Egyptians as being more than just simple folks who use simple tools to create their marvelous structures, artifacts, and particularly the statues, the Ramses statues and the statue of Akhenaten, Amenhotep, many other absolutely wonderful works of art. But this book its publication date is July 7th.
Gotta mark that down.
And it comes 12 years after the Giza power plant was published.
Wow.
So I'm really excited about this one. It's and this book is focused strictly on the evidence. There are no unsupportable theories in the book. I don't consider the Giza power plant to be an unsupportable theory, but it still needs to be tested to some degree. But in this book, I actually go straight to the heart of the issue and argue for the brilliance of ancient Egyptian engineers and what they were able to accomplish thousands of years ago, when they were only supposed to have had simple copper tools. They were cutting or shaping granite using stone chisels or stone balls, wooden hammers, and really, really crude instruments.
Right.
And so,
right.
And it's accompanied with some marvelous photography.
Excellent.
That
I'm really jealous
I started to key in on the precision of some of the artifacts in Egypt, particularly the precision of the Ramses statue. Now, you wouldn't think, because when you travel to Egypt, or if you go to a museum and you walk past a statue, that statue or you are constantly in motion, so your point of view is changing constantly. My intention in photographing the statue was to actually fix the camera along the central axis of the statue, so the distribution of material was equal on both sides. And in that way, I could do a computer analysis, a CAD analysis, and take some measurements, or at least compare features one with the other. And what I found on the Ramses statue was an incredible symmetry. And this symmetry is impossible to accomplish just with the eye. I have consulted with sculptors, I've consulted with physicists, mechanical engineers, and everybody who sees this symmetry that I demonstrate in my book are absolutely amazed that they're dumbfounded that the ancient Egyptians could do it.
Right.
And so ultimately it comes down to really, really hard evidence and proof that the ancient Egyptians were much more advanced than what we give them credit for. That the simple tools that are found in the ancient Egyptian toolbox, as described by Egyptologists, are woefully inadequate to explain the artifacts. Woefully inadequate. They just don't even come close.
Now, before we get into a lot of these details here, I really want to give the listeners, a sense of your background and what makes you kind of like, an expert in this type of stuff. So, I mean, you spent, for the past 49 years, like you told me in your biography, you've been, spent, doing this high-tech manufacturing stuff. What made you, go from that technical field to studying the pyramids?
Well, I really didn't leave my technical field in studying the pyramids. I took it along with me. So,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's actually the foundation for my point of view is actually my background, and really many hours spent working with hand tools and also working with machinery, and understanding the difference between the two of what it actually takes to create something by hand, and what the results and finishes, and what it takes to produce something by machine. So really, I did not leave my background and just switch gears. It seemed like it was a natural transition or a natural field of study, and I started studying the ancient Egypt after I picked up a wonderful book by Peter Tompkins, The Secrets of the Great Pyramid. And I was browsing a bookstore one day, and this book really popped out at me. I was fascinated with it. It was beautifully illustrated. It was beautifully presented, wonderful design. And I started to read it in the shop. I didn't buy it right then because this was in 1977, and the book was $20 back then.
Right.
So, but I went back to it often enough that the shopkeeper asked me if I wanted to buy it, and so yes, okay, I'll buy it. So I got the book, took it home, and started to read it in depth. Well, surprisingly, as I was reading this book, I came across questions that had never even entered my mind in the past. And those questions were related to the origins of the Great Pyramid, and the really heretical notion that perhaps it was not a tomb. And some of the arguments that were put forth in the book to argue against the tomb theory, I thought were fairly cogent, really sound. And after I'd finished reading the book, I began to have those same questions. Surely the ancient Egyptians wouldn't have built this massive edifice with such a high level of precision just to house a body. And the thing that connected with me, or resonated with me, was the precision with which the pyramid was built. And what I was faced with was a structure built in antiquity that had the precision of a machine, only on a scale of acres. And that to me was absolutely incredible. And some of the tolerances that were described, such as, I'll give you an example.
Please.
There is the descending passage, a passageway in the Great Pyramid that goes down to a bedrock chamber. Over 150 feet of the constructed portion was measured, and it was found to be within 20 thousandths of an inch of being absolutely straight. And 20 thousandths of an inch, for those who are not familiar with dimension and of that nature, it's the thickness of a thumbnail.
Wow. I mean, I'm thinking this is like a really wide thing, and you're like, no, that's how close they were. Wow.
Yeah, and so it was that straight. And then over the entire constructed and also excavated passageway, it was 350 feet long. It was within 1/4 of an inch of being absolutely straight. So over 200 feet, we find the error, the greater error. But that's where they were actually digging out the bedrock. And even that is an incredible feat. So those things really jumped out at me and got my attention. And then, of course, studying the design of the Great Pyramid, the internal features are very unique, as you know. You have a downward passage at a 23.5-degree angle, and then you have an ascending passage on the same angle, only going up rather than descending down. And then these passageways supposedly, according to Egyptologists, led to chambers where the king was to be buried.
Right. I think we've all heard that.
Yes, but the unfortunate thing for this theory is that in the Great Pyramid there are three principal chambers. There's a subterranean chamber, then there is what they call the Queen's Chamber, and higher up there is another chamber that they call the King's Chamber. What is really puzzling about these chambers is that supposedly, what Egyptologists tell us is that the queens were not buried with their kings, so the Queen's Chamber is actually a misnomer. It was named in prehistory, or it was named early on before Egyptology became a science, or I think it's more an art than a science, but
a theory. We'll call it a theory.
Yeah, but they say that the queens weren't buried with their kings, so this second chamber was a misnomer. So they argued that they started constructing the Khufu's tomb by digging out this downward sloping shaft to a bedrock chamber. And then the king changed his mind and decided he wanted to be buried higher up in the pyramid. So then they started to construct the ascending passage, and they constructed a horizontal passage to the center of the pyramid where the misnamed Queen's Chamber is located. But then after they had completed that, the king changed his mind again and decided he wanted to be buried higher up in the pyramid. So then they abandoned that chamber and built the King's Chamber. So
that's the best they could do. That seems kind of weak to me.
Well, I'm not here to poke fun at other people's ideas or theories, but the fallacy behind that particular idea or chain of events is obvious to just about everybody, I think, except Egyptologists. But even then, there are so many anomalies within the pyramid. There are so many features that argue against it. It's really incredible to me that it doesn't dislodge them from that theory that this pyramid was used as a tomb. Right. For instance, they abandoned the Queen's Chamber, yet there are these mysterious shafts that penetrate the heart of the pyramid, and they go away from the Queen's Chamber on the north and south walls. On the south wall, they're both about 39 degrees, but they don't go anywhere. I'm not sure. Some of your listeners may be aware of the exploration of these shafts in 1993, when Rudolf Gantenbrink, a German robotics engineer, sent a robot
down there and found a door.
Yes, and he found this so-called door, which even Gantenbrink doesn't call a door. He calls it a USO, I think, amusingly, which means an unidentified stone object. So,
that's phenomenal. I did not know he called it that.
Yeah, well, cool. Engineers are known to be pretty dry with their humor. You must understand. So this USO with these copper fittings that protrude through it, mysterious copper fittings. But when they found the where it terminated, the shaft terminated, before then, the theory that the king changed his mind after the Queen's Chamber was constructed to be buried higher up in the pyramid falls apart, because the southern shaft and the northern shaft actually they terminate at a higher level than the King's Chamber. And a tremendous amount of work went into constructing these shafts. And they are very accurate. They're very accurately aligned. So that they have all these little mysterious features that just don't add up when you consider what the Great Pyramid would have been.
Well, a lot of people don't realize how big of a feat that is, especially at that time. Mainstream media, of course, and the propaganda will have you believe, of course, that they did all of this with the chisels and everything, but the preciseness of how these structures were built and these statues and so on is so amazing. It's like a lot of the structures that we live in today and we build today are still not up to that preciseness.
You're absolutely right. And that is actually the smoking gun. The smoking gun for this advanced civilization is the precision of their monuments and what it would take to actually replicate them today. And you're absolutely right. Well, if I could just digress a little bit, I'll talk about a site relating to that point. And I have a chapter on it in my next book. It's about the temple at Dendera. And I found an amazing alignments and precision in the hypostyle hall at Dendera. And here you have these contoured surfaces that actually combine and meet with other surfaces in three-dimensional space, as I am capturing images with my camera fixtured orthogonally, so that I'm actually square and looking directly up at the ceiling. I'm capturing images of the capitals on top of the columns in the hypostyle hall. And each capital is an image of Hathor's face crafted in limestone.
Wow.
And Hathor's, the features of Hathor generally given are that she appears with cow ears. She's considered to be the bovine deity, and she has cow ears. And sometimes she appears in art with the horns of a bull and a solar disk. So Hathor was considered to be the handmaiden of Ra, the god, the great god Ra, which is actually the sun. And she was considered to be the goddess of pleasure, the goddess of sex, fun, drunkenness. But she had two faces, Hathor had. She was also the goddess of destruction, death. And so after a Saturday night out,
busy woman.
Hathor, after spending Saturday night with Hathor, you better, when you wake up on Sunday morning, you're going to have a hell of a hangover.
Woo! Good time back in the day.
Yeah. But getting back to the alignment of these capitals and the craftsmanship involved in creating the capitals on these columns, what I noted was that there was an uncommon symmetry and precision, and certain features like a point on each side of the statue, which that point would be in three-dimensional space, fixed in three-dimensional space. So if you can imagine just point up in space and you have a point, just a little dot, and then another one a distance away, maybe 10 feet away, there's another dot. Okay, you strike a line between those 2 points and continue that line onto the next capital, which is about 20 feet away, and you have the same features on the next capital and the same 2 points on the next capital, and both capitals are perfectly aligned. Now, those points were created by 3 surfaces coming together. 2 flat surfaces, which were the cornice that comes across the Hathor's cowl, where it actually meets the cowl, and the cowl is like the headdress, or it's kind of like a donut shape, if you will, modified donut or torus shape geometrically, and so you have a flowing surface, a contoured surface, that is precise from one capital to the next, to the next, to the next, all the way down the hall. How do they do that? And I showed, I have some wonderful photographs in my book, color photographs and also black and white, but the two principal color photographs illustrate this beautifully. And I showed these at a conference in Paris in March. And I had an architect come up to me after the presentation, and also a patent attorney who's a biologist. And the question was, how could those alignments still exist after thousands and thousands of years? And the only answer, I didn't have an answer to that. How could we know without actually knowing what the columns rested on in terms of the foundation of footing? But the architect said, the earth moves. Yes, the earth moves. So those columns stayed perfectly in alignment. How could that
wow.
be? It's a miracle. I mean, I was, I'm still in awe of what they accomplished there. I'm still in absolute awe of what they accomplished. And that's just a small part of it.
That is
to give somebody... I'm
sorry?
I was just going to say, to give the listeners an idea of what you're talking about, most houses, when they're built, the foundation is poured. It's gravel and then concrete, and of course you have your footers. And over a span of 10 years, and sometimes just even a month or two, your foundation will shift and move because the earth that's underneath of it shifts and moves. And these structures have been in place for thousands of years.
Exactly.
How did that not move in that length of a period, a structure so precise, not move, when a house and other structures shift in, a matter of a short period?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yes, and there are two possible answers to that. One is that the earth in that area had remained still, and these were tied to the bedrock, or the entire structure was monolithic in design. In other words, all the elements were part of a monolithic structure that if one part of the structure moved, the rest of the structure moved accordingly. In other words, they all moved together by degree, depending on
I've actually done a little bit of research into an area, something similar to what you're talking about there. If you take a globe, like an actual globe with all the countries and the continents on it, and you take a compass, you take the compass and you spread it to the measurement between where Babylon was and where Luxor is, and you draw a circle. And then you find other temple sites, older temple sites, and you keep making circles around where those crosshairs are, where the circles cross paths, there's a temple. And it's almost set up geometrically all across the eastern continents there of the globe. Now, they don't match up when you get to the Western Hemisphere, but they have their own alignment, almost as if when the continents drifted apart, but what's on the actual continents, like what you're speaking about, the monolithic structure, all of them moved at once. And you can do this on any globe, and they match up almost on all of the older temples. So taking why I thought of this and was actually doing research into it was because of something I read in a book about Nikola Tesla and how he was trying to give free energy in these plants so that basically they could reach each other. And it's basically almost like what you're talking about. Like those temples were actually the power plants that were placed there on purpose in a specific grid to get power.
Well, definitely the temples are power places. There's definitely something going on there. I think the ancient Egyptians, they had a highly developed and refined acoustic science that they practiced. And I believe that the pyramids and the temples were created harmonically or harmoniously.
Christopher, before we get into that, and I definitely want to get into that, let's kind of backtrack a little bit here and just to give our listeners a really wide view of what we're talking about here. Now, how do Egyptologists tell us that the pyramids were built? They did this.
Well, the official story is that I think the Egyptologists will say nobody really knows how they built the pyramids.
Okay.
However, given the tools that we ascribe to the ancient Egyptians, they must have used copper tools. They didn't have electricity, so they hadn't developed machines. They had not even invented the wheel. And so essentially they were created with manpower using the most basic rudimentary hand tools like chisels, copper chisels, stone chisels, stone pounders for working granite, and also quartz sand for actually grinding, like grinding out holes with copper tubes and things of that nature. And then as far as the lifting of these massive stone blocks, it was a combination of manpower, ropes, and
how much does each stone block weigh? Do we know? Can we guess?
Yes, I mean, in the Great Pyramid, the casing stones weigh 16 tons. The average weight of the blocks in the Great Pyramid is 2.5 tons, though they range from 16 tons to about 1 ton at the higher elevations or the higher layers. The heaviest blocks in the Great Pyramid are above the King's Chamber, and those are the granite beams above the King's Chamber, which weigh around 70 tons. And granite was brought from Aswan supposedly down the Nile River, and then dragged up ramps to be placed above the King's Chamber.
So they also rolling logs is how they brought them up, actually up the ramp. So they didn't drag them like on the ground. They had rolling logs, correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, they've had different explanations. That's one of them, the log rolling.
Okay.
The other one is that they put a slurry. They use cow's milk or something like that to grease the ground and to let them roll freely. We have seen documentaries, I think, you may have seen one too, where they use sleds, and they've also used rolling logs to move them across the ground.
Okay.
So that is the simplest and the conventional theory for how the pyramids were built.
All right. So you're a guy who builds things for a living. Let's start with the hand tools and that sort of thing. I mean, you were describing the face of Hathor in one of these temples and how precise it was. You've worked with these types of tools. Can we get away with it? I mean, is it hard to do this? Will it take an extremely long time? Can you get it done with that amount of precision? I mean,
no. Short answer, no.
Okay.
This is the thing. I mean, there are so many theorists. I mean, we call them armchair theorists that they enumerate and they basically perform a particular task. Normally, it's the simplest task that they can perform, such as moving a 2-ton block of stone across the ground, and then they take that success and then they multiply upwards and say, okay, so it took us so many hours to drag this so many feet, and so they multiply that by the distance, by the manpower that they would need to drag a a 16-ton block, and then they would actually add to that the amount of manpower it would take to do it in a reasonable amount of time. So that most of the theories on how the pyramids were built are actually based on focus on how the stones were moved. And indeed, there was an architect who went to Egypt with Mark Lenner and did a study, and he did he went home and plugged everything into the computer, and he calculated that he could build a pyramid, with time management software at hand. You could build it in 10 years. But I'm sitting at home, and I have in my files a letter that was given to an author by the name of Richard Noon, and the writer of this letter was Merle Booker. Now, Merle Booker was the director of the Indiana Limestone Institute. And Richard Noon had approached Merle Booker and said, I would like you to provide me with a quote for delivering enough limestone to build a Great Pyramid today. Mm-hmm. Well, Merle Booker had the whole industry at his disposal. I mean, that's basically what he did, was provide quotations, and he was, very experienced in the industry. And he returned with a time estimate. He didn't put a price on it, but he said that it would take all 33 of Indiana's quarries around Bedford, Indiana, working 3 shifts. And it assumes that there would be no equipment breakdowns, there would be no labor unrest or walkouts or strikes, and to just deliver the stone without even assembling it into the geometric structure that is the Great Pyramid would take 27 years.
Wow.
So
I mean,
this is a man who knows what it takes with modern machinery, modern equipment to break the stone out of the quarry, to dress it, to move it from one place to another, and to supply that much stone would take 27 years. So when you think about that, and then you think about what is theorized in the mainstream media, on National Geographic, or with conventional Egyptologists describing how the pyramids were built, just remember Merle Booker and ask the question, okay, so this is what it takes to move the stone. We have time in quarrying it. We have time in dressing the stone. It's an enormous amount of time. And actually, to create, because the other thing that we have to keep in mind, as you're well aware, is that the stones that went into the Great Pyramid were fitted extremely precisely.
Yeah. Now, what type of tools would be needed to fit the stones that precisely?
You would have to go back to the quarrying technique, and that takes time. And when you quarry something of that size and make it that precise, you're talking about a feat that is it's rough to do it today with the tools that we have.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't have, even with modern tools, we would think twice before engaging such an enterprise. With copper chisels and wooden mallets, I don't think a project like this would even come on your radar.
No.
Unless you were fairly confident that you could actually develop the tools and get it done in a reasonable amount of time. So this is one of the points that I make in my next book. That is that we're expected to believe that a civilization like the mighty ancient Egyptians started on their path using copper tools, stone implements, stone balls, stone chisels, ropes, wood, you name it, but everything was crude. And that civilization thrived for 3,000 years. And let me ask you this question. What tools were they using at the end of the civilization? After 3,000 years, what tools were they in possession of? Well, according to Egyptologists, stone tools, copper tools. They hadn't developed their tools one bit over 3,000 years. And when you look at the brilliance in their architecture, in their statues, in their pyramids, when you look at the intelligence and the brilliance of what they created, and we're expected to believe that they couldn't apply that intelligence, that genius, into developing better tools.
Yes,
it boggles
absolutely.
the mind. It just seems it's so counterintuitive that, well, this is one person that just doesn't believe it.
Yes.
I mean, look at our civilization and what we have been able to develop in just 50 years.
Right.
Imagine, if our civilization lasted for 3,000 years, what would it look like? Unless we had de-evolved, so to speak, or gone backwards, which, I mean, that's...
Serious de-evolution.
Yeah. But,
right. It really doesn't make any much sense that something so precise and so, wonderfully built was done so crudely. It's almost like that is. It's like Catch-22, like, huh? I don't understand.
But then,
there's a lot.
Again... Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say that, again, there are so many people that listen to the mainstream media, and they really don't have an idea of how difficult a task it is, even just to quarry, not just to move, because they have no experience actually doing these things. But someone with experience working with hand tools, working with power tools, some experience reading blueprints or building, as I have, and obviously you have lots of experience, the viewpoint actually shifts once you have that experience. And there's so many people that don't have that experience. So they just think, oh, they just did it, and it took them this long to do it.
Right. So enlighten me, when we talk about quarry, I mean, we're talking about like, we go up to a bed of rock or whatever, we get our little hammers or whatever, and then we cut out the rock, and then we've got to form it to that perfect rectangle that the blocks are for the pyramid, right? Is that how we do it?
Yeah, they're supposed to be setting one block every 20 seconds because they have 2.5 million blocks inside the Great Pyramid. So
wow,
to build it in 20 years, they were really hauling. But
oh my goodness! Woo, I don't think you could crack a whip fast enough. I don't know.
Well, it does become a little humorous sometimes when you start to ponder on it. The evidence is there though that to reshape people's thinking on what the ancient Egyptians were capable of. We just have to take our blinkers off, and I don't know whether it's because in the West we have these cultural assumptions about that particular part of the country. I know that when you read some of the old literature from Victorian times, it seems to be laced with a little chauvinism or even racism. But I think we're enlightened enough today, for the most part, that we can move through those cultural assumptions and start to recognize what the ancient Egyptians were capable of doing.
Absolutely. There was a question in the chat room, Christopher, and I want to pose it to you because we were talking about why the foundation of the pyramid didn't move, or maybe moved all at once. And the question was, could the pyramid really be an octahedron, and that's why the foundation doesn't shift?
A pyramid under the pyramid. Yeah, I mean, there has been that speculation. I haven't seen any evidence to support it. I mean, you can theoretically imagine a pyramid under the pyramid, but I would have thought that some of the ground-penetrating radar would have turned something up by now. Though, having said that, there are legends, if you will, and the thing is, we try to stay with hard evidence and not anecdotal evidence or hearsay, but but sometimes that's all you have, and certainly historians and Egyptologists are not loath to work off of hearsay. But the legends are that there are the whole plateau is riddled with tunnels and chambers and shafts, and when you actually go on site and you walk around the pyramids, there are these really mysterious shafts that go vertically down into the bedrock, and while they're filled with sand, you kind of wonder, where do they go to? What were they there for? And trying to find answers to those questions, of course, is, it feeds speculation. But I think it is better served to do more exploration, and unfortunately, the exploration of those shafts is reliant on the powers that be in Egypt. And so, a lot of what you and I would like to, the research that you and I may want to see done, is not going to be listened to.
I have a quick question.
Please go ahead now, Chizedek. No, please go right ahead.
I was just going to say, what exact mineral was used? What stone exactly was used? I know they used a certain kind of granite for the big blocks above the King's Chamber, correct?
Yes. The Great Pyramid is constructed mainly of limestone. The core limestone, or the limestone that actually fabricated the core of the pyramid, was quarried locally, and it's what they call a nummulitic type of limestone. It has seashells in it, foraminifers, and some of the seashells are visible when you actually look at the limestone. The finer, the casing stone, and also the limestone that lines the chambers on the inside, not the King's Chamber, but the passageways and the Grand Gallery, the Queen's Chamber. That limestone is Tura, white fine Tura limestone, which was quarried about 20 miles away from the Great Pyramid.
Well, the reason why I brought that up was because you brought up a point about vibration, and vibration, of course, holds many secrets that have still yet to be revealed, I feel, and there's people actually working in that field. But I wonder if there's some type of vibrational frequency that they used with stone to keep them in place, almost like a vibrational pin and dowel to keep the stones in place. Do you see what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, and the interesting thing about the way the stone was put together, and it is really evident when you look at Khafre's pyramid, which is the third largest pyramid on the Giza plateau, and particularly also at the Red Pyramid, or the Bent Pyramid. And the Bent Pyramid, Dashur, you see that the stones are cut on compound angles, so that the casing stones are actually locked into place, so they can't move one way or another. The whole structure is monolithic because of the compound angles. In other words, the stones are angled vertically and also horizontally. So they fit together in a way where if one would move, then the other one would move with it. And it's really a unique construction method. And the Khafre pyramid, the third pyramid on the Giza plateau, which has a granite outer casing, those are particular. That they are cut like trapezoids. So they're like a trapezoid shape, and even on the paving stone to the east of Khafre's pyramid, you'll see that some of the stones are curved and actually match each other. It's almost like the Great Wall at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where you
Yes.
have these 12-sided stones and the unusual Inca architecture that you find in Peru and Bolivia. So,
which is also
yeah, and I think, like you said, for vibration, it has been determined by engineers and architects that these are perfect designs for withstanding earthquakes or tremors of the earth, and I can see that because the stones are constructed so that the whole structure is locked in a monolithic way, so it would move in unison rather than break apart. Like we build with cubes or square blocks, rectangular blocks. Each surface is flat, and then we lay one on top of the other and overlap. Those kind of walls actually break apart. But if you had like a V shape in one with a matching, a concave radius on one block and a convex radius on the block that fits it, then those two stones are actually locked in together, and they would move in unison. So when it comes to the Great Pyramid, we see some of that. A lot of what, of course, we can only observe what the outside and what is actually visible at the surface. How they lock together on the inside, we don't know. Well, there's little bits of information that seem to suggest that they were using very efficient machinery to cut the blocks. And in 2006, I visited a very mysterious site just about 5 miles away from Giza called Abu Rawash. And Abu Rawash is I don't know whether the pyramid was never finished or whether it was destroyed and taken apart. There are theories that suggest both scenarios, but it's a flat-topped pyramid. It has a chamber with a downward-sloping passageway going to a bedrock chamber that's open to the sky, so it never was finished. But in 2006, when I went there, I noticed from the top of the pyramid a piece of granite laying in the forecourt at the base of the pyramid. And this was the only, from the vision that I had, it's only about 100 feet tall, but from where I could see, it was the only piece that actually appeared to have a finish to it, or a polish to it. And I climbed down the pyramid and went over to this granite, and normally when I go to Egypt, I take a straight edge with me, and the straight edge I have is 12 inches long. It's a steel blade, if you will, and the edge is finished to within 1/10,000th of an inch. Now, 1/10,000th of an inch is 1/20th the thickness of a human hair. So it's a very, very finely finished, very precise instrument. And I've used it on other artifacts that we can discuss after I finish with this particular topic. But laying it on the surface, I noticed that the surface of this granite was curved. It wasn't flat. And most of the granite artifacts that I've measured before have been flat, incredibly flat and precise. This one was curved. Now, the interesting thing that the surface of it had a curvature to it. But looking down on top of this piece of granite, there was a radius where it appeared that the saw that cut that curved surface had terminated. And so I set about photographing this particular piece, and from both the top, looking down, and also from the end, so that I could determine what radius it was cut to. And essentially, what I determined was that the radius where the saw terminated its cut would have been about, it would have been half the diameter of a 37-foot saw, 37-foot diameter saw. So that was an incredible discovery. My mind was blown just at that. How did they apply that tool to that surface? And taking a macro lens for my camera and focusing in on the granite, there are some very, very specific telltale tool marks on the surface of the granite where you can see where the saw had actually passed across it. So this was not the result of a stone ball or even a copper saw that was charged with sand, but it was the result of a highly efficient saw, because the feed lines, I call them feed lines. In other words, these in manufacturing, the feed line is the distance that a tool travels in a cycle. Say on a lathe, is the distance the tool would travel across in one revolution of the lathe. So these feed lines indicated a feed rate of about 50 thousandths of an inch, just under 1/16th of an inch. So that was fairly significant to me, and obviously the result, the reflective of some kind of a machine that did the work.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing was that as I was totally blown away and baffled by this, because my mind stretches beyond the mainstream media, as you probably know, in terms of what the ancient Egyptians were capable of, and I certainly proposed some rather far-out kind of ideas, or at least far out as far as conventional theories go. This was totally unexpected and surprising to me. It was mind-blowing, because here I was standing in front of an artifact that reflected a technology that nobody had been talking about.
Right.
It reflected a technology that showed that the ancient Egyptians were using mega machines. I mean, we're talking 37 feet diameter, and when you consider, say, an analog today, if we look at machinery of that size, if we look at the tunnel that goes underneath the English Channel from England to France, they call it the Channel.
Mm-hmm.
The diameter of the tunnel borer for that particular tunnel was 27 feet in diameter. And I don't know of any manufacturing company that currently employs a 37-foot diameter saw. Certainly,
wow.
Granite manufacturers are those who actually cut granite into countertops or even precision gauge equipment or machine tool bases. They use slabbing saws that are about 12 feet in diameter, but 37 feet in diameter. That was amazing.
That's a great big.
I was going to say, that's a big saw. Good Lord.
Yeah, that is, I mean, you could put all kinds of adjectives to it. That's a big, that was a beast of a saw. And my mind, of course, I started to ponder on, well, how did they fixture this? I mean, if you're using a 37-foot diameter saw, how did you use it? I mean, it's not like a circular saw that you would use in your garage by any means. Was it a table, like a table saw, where most of the saw is actually beneath the table and just the top? Because obviously this piece had been cut near the center line of the radius of the saw, of the axis of the saw rather. So they had to have reached the center point, close to the center point of the saw, in order to create the radius as it appeared. Well, interestingly enough, in the general vicinity of the Abu Rawash Pyramid is a very, very long and deep trench. And this trench is about 19 feet deep. It's about 30 feet long. No, it's longer than that. But it is like a gash in the ground, and it was labeled by Egyptologists to be a bolt pit. And bolt pits were supposedly cut into the Giza Plateau and also at Abu Ruwash near the pyramids. These bolt pits were supposedly representative of the solar boat that took the king through the Duat into the afterlife. But the question that I have is, after that was, well, these would be ideal to fixture a 37-foot diameter saw.
Wow. Yes, they would. That's amazing.
That's an amazing coincidence right there.
Yeah, and when you actually look at the shape of the trench, it's very narrow at the top and it's very, very deep. I mean, it does not have the shape of a hull of a boat. It just wouldn't work. And believe me, I know. I did the cardboard derby at the YMCA with my kids when my kids were young, and we built boats out of cardboard and duct tape, and a hull of that shape just doesn't go very far. I mean, it doesn't work. So anyway, going from Abu Ruwash though, I went over to Giza, because Giza has numerous bolt pits around the Great Pyramid, and there's also one near Khafre's pyramid, and I started to look closer at these. And in the general vicinity there, you see there's a basalt pavement. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of the limestone, you don't see any saw marks on the limestone. Probably because the limestone has eroded over the years. But the basalt and granite, the saw marks actually survive, and you can see a lot of saw marks on the basalt pavement to the east of the Great Pyramid. And also, in the general vicinity, you have these so-called bolt pits, which I now call saw trenches, because I definitely believe that that's what they were used for.
Wow,
and the interesting thing,
a lot of sense.
though, is even at Giza, we find evidence for circular saws.
Wow.
And so what I envision is that when they were constructing the pyramid, the quarrying took place a distance away, but they were able to put that very, very precise pyramid together very efficiently by cutting blocks to size by running them through a giant saw.
Wow.
And,
that's amazing.
These were not primitive individuals. They were not primitive fools. They were highly intelligent, and they had the tools that were equal to the task at hand.
Wow.
Period.
So, yeah. So now I have to ask, if, the Giza, the Big Pyramid is not a tomb, like they've told us, what is it? Why was it built with such precision? What, from an engineering perspective, and all your, 49 years of experience, what do you think this thing is?
Well, I started from the perspective of an engineer, obviously, and as I saw the pyramid, I saw it as a gigantic edifice that was built with the precision of a machine. So the first question that came to my mind, well, if it is a machine, what kind of machine was it? How did it function? Mm-hmm. And then because of its size and the amount of resources that went into it, and granted I was using modern logic when it comes to economies of scale and so forth. Generally, if you pour resources into a project, you like to get something out of it. Certainly in the past, ancient cultures have invested tremendous resources in religious places, mosques, temples, and cathedrals, and they do get something out of that, and they still do to this day. But the Great Pyramid was really different. And I mean, the precision with which it was built, the unusual design of the interior. It was very mysterious, and there've been a lot of minds actually set about trying to figure out just exactly what all those features did within the Great Pyramid. And when I considered it, I was actually reading Tompkins' book, and then it kind of struck me like a thunderbolt, if you will, that it was generating power. And it seemed like it appeared in my mind that the power was generated within the pyramid and flowed out of the shafts, because the reason for those shafts in the King's Chamber specifically had not been satisfactorily answered to me by conventional theories, and so I knew that they had to have had a very special purpose. Well, while I had the germ of the idea that it was actually generating energy, at that time, this was in 1977, I didn't know what kind of energy, I didn't know where the energy came from, or any other part of that. And so when I set about doing my research, obviously what I had to do was satisfy the evidence and be a slave to the evidence, because ultimately, the evidence rules. If you can't come up with a theory that leaves a piece of evidence just hanging there without an explanation. So I started to investigate and gather information and learn as much as I could about what the Great Pyramid actually contained in terms of the design, the dimensions, and also, more importantly, some of the unique features within the Great Pyramid that were noted by earlier researchers. So,
I have to back up, because I don't think too many people are familiar with that. You said by some of the unique features.
Yes.
Such as?
Yes.
Just give an example.
You want one of the unique features?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay.
A couple examples.
I was getting to that.
I'm with you.
That is one of the things that requires an answer, and so when I was reading about the Great Pyramid, my attention was drawn to the King's Chamber because it was probably the most unique and baffling structures in the pyramid. Or even in Egypt, it was. I mean, the so-called King's Chamber was a real enigma, because here in a body of limestone, you had a granite chamber with 5 layers of gigantic granite beams above the chamber. And so the first question I had was, well, why 5 layers of granite? Why do they have 5 layers of granite above this King's Chamber? And the conventional theory is that they were called relieving chambers, and they were speculated or theorized to relieve the weight of the pyramid or the stone from the flat layer or the flat beams, so that the king could have a flat roof in his chamber, unlike the so-called Queen's Chamber below, which has a gabled roof. And the Queen's Chamber's gabled roof or ceiling is comprised of cantilevered blocks where the weight pressing down on these blocks is actually transferred outside the walls, so that it doesn't collapse.
Oh, wow.
So, interestingly, that theory that the King's Chamber was constructed because the king wanted a flat roof instead of a gable ceiling, or a flat ceiling instead of a gable ceiling, and they had to have 5 layers of these granite beams to relieve that flat ceiling. When you actually look at the structure itself, you can see that these 5 layers of granite beams are holding up nothing but their own weight. And really, the structural support for that chamber, or the protection of that entire chamber, comes from a design the same that you see with the Queen's Chamber, and that is cantilevered and gabled blocks that form the ceiling above the assembly of granite beams. So that was one peculiar feature. The other feature that Sir William Flinders Petrie noted when he was doing his studies inside the Great Pyramid was that the entire chamber had somehow become pushed out, or it had moved. There had been some disturbance in the past that caused the chamber to push out over an inch, and the granite beams, the first layer of granite beams, had some cracks down along the south side. So that was puzzling to me, and also the explanation for that, the conventional explanation, was that this was caused by an earthquake. Well, right then, that didn't make sense to me, because generally in an earthquake, structures will collapse, whereas here, this whole chamber had expanded, and so that's when I got the aha. There was energy being created, and there was a certain force or energy that actually caused that chamber to expand. And as I started to study further and get other pieces of the puzzle in place, I became aware of the unique function of the Queen's Chamber and how it played a part in the what I call the explosion hypothesis, or how it played a part in the explosion in the King's Chamber. So it is all these unique features and that actually find answers or proposed answers in the Giza power plant. Why the King's Chamber was designed in the way it was. Why they used granite in the design of the King's Chamber, and what the Queen's Chamber was used for, and what the shafts leading to the Queen's Chamber but not quite connecting to the Queen's Chamber, what they were used for. I mean, we talked earlier about the shafts leading from the Queen's Chamber, and how Gantenbrink's robot found the so-called door, or USO, but before 1874, people going into that chamber would not have seen those shafts because they were not completed. Wayman Dixon, an English traveler, went into the chamber and he started tapping around on the walls, and he noted a hollow sounding feedback from around that area, and he noticed a crack in the wall, so he pushed a rod through it. It disappeared, or it went through freely. So he had the limestone chiseled away and revealed the shafts. So, and he did the same on the north wall and found the northern shaft. So the interesting thing is that the early travelers actually revealed quite a bit about that chamber, and also anecdotal information too, such as the smell of the chamber. It had a very foul odor, which people claim that, well, the tourists went in there and relieved themselves. And of course, I wouldn't dare to say that, well, that they already have relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. So, but why would they go in the Queen's Chamber? But yeah, sometimes my sense of humor falls flat with serious people. But the interesting thing about it was, though, not just the foul odor in that chamber, but also it was the walls were covered with salt up to an inch thick.
That's odd.
And salt was found also along the horizontal passage in the lower parts of the Grand Gallery. Well, what I theorized in the Giza power plant, and I'll say at the outset that it is just a theory. I mean, it's not a fact, but it's a theory that seems to be surviving the test of time and also discovery. Because in my book I say, if somebody's got a better idea, let's let's look at it, let's examine it. But whatever anybody comes up with, they have to be able to satisfy all the evidence and explain everything.
Right.
And so the theory that I propose is that they, in the so-called Queen's Chamber, they were creating hydrogen by combining two chemicals, hydrated zinc chloride and a dilute hydrochloric acid solution, which combined in the Queen's Chamber and boiled up hydrogen. That would actually cause the leaching of salts from the walls, but the limestone itself would serve as a drying agent for the hydrogen. And so the hydrogen gas would give up its moisture and it would purify by passing along the horizontal passage. And then it would enter into the Grand Gallery and ultimately into the King's Chamber. So the hydrogen is actually used to satisfy another piece of evidence. And that piece of evidence is, again, we're going back to the King's Chamber and some of the very unusual features in there. The two shafts that come into the King's Chamber, there's one from the north face and one from the south. The one from the north face has dimensions of 8.4 inches wide and 4.8 inches high. And the opening to the shaft on the south wall of the King's Chamber is a rather bulbous opening, and it has the appearance of being a parabola, like a microwave horn antenna. So this is where the hydrogen comes in. 4.8 or 8.4 inches would approximate the dimensions of a waveguide for hydrogen microwave, which would be the wavelength of hydrogen is 8.309 inches, or 21 centimeters. And that particular frequency, that radiation is constantly bombarding the Earth from the universe on a daily basis. I mean, 24/7. It never stops. It's background radiation. And they say that if we ever, that would be the carrier signal if we're ever, ET ever decides to communicate with people on this planet, they would use the 21 centimeter carrier signal. So what I propose in the Giza power plant is that they were collecting that background hydrogen frequency and feeding it through the waveguide into the King's Chamber. And within the King's Chamber, the hydrogen was driven to a higher energy state, so that it was in a state where, as the microwave energy passed through it, it would stimulate emission of electrons or photons. It would bump the electrons to ground state, and that would emit what is called a photon, but it's a little particle of energy with a frequency that is in the microwave region of the spectrum. So the hydrogen coming into the King's Chamber was driven to a higher energy state through the introduction of sound. And the sound was created, or the vibrations were created through the pyramid. They passed through the pyramid, and they were collected in the Grand Gallery. And if we go to the Grand Gallery, we see a very long hallway, that's why they call it grand, because when you go inside the Great Pyramid and you're climbing up the ascending passageway, you crouch down because it's only about 41 inches square, and then you come into the Grand Gallery and you can finally stand up and you look up and you say, wow, how grand. But this gallery is it's about 28 feet high. It's 80 inches wide at the bottom and 42 inches wide at the top. And actually there are corbelled layers of limestone that go into the structure. Along the ramps, there's two ramps, one on each side of the gallery and a central trough, but then along the ramps are these little cutouts or little indentations, if you will. And there's 27 pair of them along the length of the gallery. So in the Giza power plant, I propose that within these slots, if you will, where they installed resonator banks, and the resonators actually responded to the vibration in the pyramid and emitted airborne sound. So then we come, that airborne sound is then focused channeled through the passageway through an acoustic filter, and then it enters the King's Chamber. And the King's Chamber, being comprised of granite and having those 5 overlying layers of beams, starts to respond to that energy and emits its own energy, own frequency. And that energy is driven to a higher and higher state. And even the piezoelectric properties of the granite would come into bear. So you would have very, very high frequency energy and also electromagnetic frequencies too. That would affect the hydrogen, driving it to a higher state. Now the evidence for these resonators, I found actually after the book was published in 2001, when I was inside the Great Pyramid. They had closed the pyramid for months, and they were cleaning the inside of it. And of course, when they closed the Great Pyramid, there's all kinds of rumors on the internet about all kinds of skullduggery going on. You know, people they're pulling out treasure. They probably found Khufu's mummy, or you know, you name it. There's all kinds of dastardly things going on when anything happens with the Great Pyramid. But when I was there in 2001, yes, they had indeed cleaned the inside. I mean, you could tell it was notable. But interestingly, on the ceiling of the Grand Gallery, there are these really significant and clearly noticeable scorch marks. And there's 2, one on each side of the ceiling, and directly above the slots. So the theory that resonators would have been housed within that structure, within that space, seems to be borne out by these scorch marks on the ceiling. And folks can go to my website, and there is an article on my website about it's called, if you scroll down, it's called Supportive Evidence for the Explosion Hypothesis. And there's I include an image from my book, Figure 42, the Grand Gallery Resonators, and also 2 photographs that I took at that time in 2001 of the scorch marks on the inside of the Grand Gallery. And you can see that these are not smudges from ancient torches. This is serious damage to the limestone that they could not clean off, and there are numerous. So if we come full circle, or maybe we haven't even come full circle, but if we go back to the theory that energy was being created within the King's Chamber, and microwaves were actually being generated with the hydrogen gas, the hydrogen microwave coming through the northern shaft and then stimulating emission from the hydrogen in the chamber. And if we consider what may have happened in prehistory with a cataclysm, maybe a comet strike or something really bad happened, we know that bad things have happened in prehistory, and civilization has actually had extinction events in prehistory, and the population been reduced to mere thousands. So if we consider, if we want to consider that the pyramid is much, much older than what we've been taught, maybe going back thousands and thousands of years early. I mean, some Arabic writings on the pyramid claim that it's 76,000 years old. Of course, Egyptologists would scoff at that. There are some that believe it's 36,000 years old. There are others who believe it was 10,000 years old. How far back do you want to go before you say, okay, this was the event that caused the demise of this civilization? The Great Pyramid was functioning at that time, but because of its nature, the Great Pyramid was caused to shake apart. And you will see, it was severely damaged by earth forces, earth movements. It's finely tuned to the vibration of the earth, or the cycles of the earth, or the hum, or the seismic forces that exist within the earth. And it's a finely tuned device. It's a coupled oscillator. In other words, a coupled oscillator is a vibrating device that, when coupled to a source of energy and is matched with the frequency of that, or harmonic thereof, it will continue to draw energy from the source as long as that energy exists. But a coupled oscillator is a finely tuned device, and if it was tuned to maximize the throughput of energy from the earth, and then suddenly there's more energy in the earth than it can handle, then some really bad things can happen. And so what I propose is that something did happen. It was very destructive. It affected the whole civilization, and in turn the Great Pyramid. Now, if you've got some of the outer casing stones being shaken off, you probably also have some of the tools or some of the equipment or instruments that would be necessary to keep the pyramid sealed, so that the air doesn't enter into, or oxygen doesn't enter into the environment. And then at this point in time, there was a spark or something set the hydrogen off, and the explosion caused the chamber to push out. It also, when the explosion also affected the resonators in the Grand Gallery, which burned up in the explosion, and perhaps the rest of them, or whatever was left, was removed by later explorers, or who knows? I mean, we can only speculate, but just looking at the evidence that's left, it does appear that there was energy created within the Great Pyramid.
So let me backtrack here, Christopher, and so I'm wrapping my brain around all this awesome information. So what you're saying is that in the Queen's Chamber, which is below the King's Chamber, that they used that to create hydrogen, and then it was pushed up through this shaft into the Grand Galley, and then from there it moved up into the King's Chamber. And in the King's Chamber is where they introduced sound, and that's through this hydrogen, and they created energy from it.
Correct. Except the sound was generated within the Grand Gallery. The King's Chamber acted like a resonator itself. It drew the sound. It could have actually been an acoustic engine in itself.
Wow.
I've had communication with a physicist who actually differed with what I proposed in terms of how the King's Chamber functioned. He thinks it's more of an acoustic engine, but which would be a heat engine. So, and I would have to defer to him. It's immaterial to me. I mean, if there's a different way for this to work and function properly, and I'm not correct in my initial analysis, then I'm willing to say, okay, that's great. We'll go with that one. But it does, whatever is proposed has to actually explain the evidence there.
Right. I didn't know that you could get energy by adding sound to hydrogen. That's actually fascinating to me. That's pretty cool. Now,
I think energy is energy. I don't think just, sound that you and I are familiar with would have an effect.
A very specific.
There are devices today, and I think, this physicist who contacted me, I think he has a point, that there are acoustic devices today that generate a tremendous amount of heat. and well, actually, they have acoustic refrigerators. I mean, generally it's a heat source, and but if you look at the Great Pyramid, and it's a little bigger than a refrigerator, and the amount of energy that it could generate could be quite significant.
Yeah, it's a big point. Now, how did they, if your theory is correct, how did they use this energy? I mean, from coming together in the king's chamber, where does it go then?
Well, that's an excellent question. The interesting thing that I noted, and of course, I've gone this far in proposing that the Great Pyramid was a power plant. I mean, I think in the academic mind, I'm already a refugee from.
We like you here. It's okay. Forget that.
Actually, maybe not even a refugee, maybe firmly ensconced in fruitcake land. I don't know.
As soon as you disagree with them on the fact that it's not a tomb, I mean, that was it. They were laughing at you and they weren't listening. But that's okay. We're listening, so forget that.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, it's you can't take yourself too seriously. But but I do take the research seriously, and I'm very serious about the evidence. But if we look for answers to your question of what did they use the energy for, and where did it go after it exited the southern shaft, the interesting thing about the southern shaft is at a 45-degree angle, and the direction it would go if you project it into space. It would pass the equatorial plane fairly close to where you would park a geosynchronous satellite. And on a little bit of whimsy, I actually put in my book a relay satellite that showed the energy going to a satellite and being redirected to some other place on the planet. There have been other theories, speculations that it was the Great Pyramid was a beacon, and certainly, depending on the level of energy being generated, it could serve as a beacon too, or a communication device. You name it.
Wow. So energy could have passed from the king's chamber down this up this 45-degree angle shaft and powered whatever.
Exactly. I mean, maybe it was powering. I mean, the other thing is that those who are not willing to consider this idea would be quick to say, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right. Where's the plug?
The power tools built the Great Pyramid. What do they power the power tools with? And that's really a fallacious argument, because today we build power plants and we take portable generators to the site. And when we look into the past and we look into ancient Egypt, what we see is just the skeleton of the civilization. And that skeleton is the igneous rock and the limestone and all the other stone artifacts. And some of the impervious metals like gold, silver, and copper. If they indeed were a part of the culture that built the Great Pyramid, they still exist. But to the extent that material science had it developed in the ancient past, we don't have any evidence really to support that. We have materials developed today that I can't say confidently that they would have developed them in prehistory. I suspect. I mean, I have a hunch that they had them. But when you consider how they were able to cut stones so efficiently, you have to ask the question: just what kind of materials did they have, and how much of it has disappeared?
Well,
because
perhaps
over thousands and thousands of years, I mean, our ferrous materials would have rusted away. In a few hundred years. I mean, the Life After Us, I think, was a documentary that examined what would happen to Life After People. What would happen after people if people left the planet? And pretty much after 500 years, things had returned to nature. All our fantastic structures and skyscrapers would have toppled over. You know, the technology that we use to just maintain our civilization is quite significant. And what would
so it's very possible that while this magnificent structure that they built, you know, has survived the test of time, the tools that they use to do it, not so much.
Not so much, no. Obviously, this is circumstantial evidence or secondary evidence. The machines have not turned up. I don't know if they ever will, but they certainly left their mark.
Go ahead, Melchizedek.
On a note on powering the machines, could they have used some kind of vibrational frequency, much like we have Wi-Fi for our computers and stuff, but a different form of it, to remotely power instead of having batteries and having extension cord plugs, if you will?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, you're getting into the whole idea of Tesla technology now. And I think while Tesla, he built his tower at Wardenclyffe, and eventually the rug was pulled out from under him. They pulled the funding from that project. We don't know. I don't know the real reasons why, but the indications are that the technology, he had developed the technology to transmit energy through the earth, through the environment, and so and also he demonstrated that you could transmit electricity wirelessly. So to say that you know, in order to accept the idea that the Great Pyramid was a power plant, in order to accept it, we have to find copper wires strung all over the place. I think that kind of limits us in getting to the truth of the matter.
That's why I say do away with the copper wires and just strictly focus on.
Even if they did have copper wires, what would a surviving tribe or surviving culture do with that copper wire?
They would collect and make things out of it. They wouldn't leave it lay there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, any material. I mean, even if they had ferrous metals like we have, they would certainly reshape them to do whatever they want. I mean, you look at our power plants and what we rely on to keep our power plants running. The company that I work for is we manufacture gas turbine engine products, and the metals that we use are exotic aerospace metals, Inconels. They are chrome, cobalt, different kinds of high temperature, corrosion resistant metals. And some of the elements that go into making the metal, like chrome, that comes from South Africa. So there's a supply chain that is intact right now to keep our civilization running. And these power plants, they need spare parts occasionally, you know. If that supply chain or the knowledge it takes to, you know, the extraction technologies that are that we have today, if those are lost, then, you know, what happens? I mean, things come to a screeching halt because our technology is so specialized that it's not contained in one place. It's spread out across the planet.
Yes.
Right. There is, I don't know if we can find an answer to this, but I'm going to post a question because there's a question in the chat room. They're talking about how, you know, using these saws to make the pyramid was one thing, but then now constructing the saw is a different thing entirely. And the question was, you know, what would the saw have been made out of, and what went into that sort of construction, just to make the thing that made the pyramid.
Well, again, I think what we have to do is stretch our imaginations, or at least, you know, suspend our disbelief that the ancient Egyptians were more advanced than what we give them credit for, and assume that they were certainly as smart as we were in terms of how saws were constructed. I mean,
right. I would think they'd have to be to make the pyramids. I mean, that's proof right there.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, they were certainly very capable. What brilliant designers, engineers, architects, construction people. It's an incredible. It's actually humbling for me as a manufacturer to go to some of these sites, particularly into the Great Pyramid or the Temple of Luxor, and stand in the shadow of these giant, perfectly crafted statues that weigh 600 to 1,000 tons, and wonder how they were cut and how they were moved, and what went into their design, and the replication of the Ramses image, which is perfected on each statue. I mean, all of these things come to my mind because, I have been in the business of making things.
Right, that's what you do. So I have to ask the ignorant question here. Could we duplicate that day? Could we make another Great Pyramid with the precision that they did it before?
I think that it would be possible if we put our minds to it collectively, but we would have to employ all disciplines in the manufacture. The physics of it, the manufacturing, the precision. If you talk to a quarry worker, they do not work to the precision that we find in the Great Pyramid. I'll give you an example. In the research for the Giza power plant, I traveled to Bedford, Indiana, and I talked to a stonemason who worked in one of the quarries there. His name was Tom Adams. And I asked him, I said, what tolerances do you work to in the quarry? And in manufacturing, the tolerances are it's like a tolerance band. So if you have something that is 1 foot, a dimension of 1 foot, you put a tolerance of plus or minus, say, 10 thousandths of an inch, or plus or minus 1 thousandth of an inch. I asked him what tolerance he worked to, and he said 1/4 of an inch. Well, the casing stones on the Great Pyramid were cut to within 10 thousandths of an inch.
So obviously their quality control was much better than ours.
Yes, and it becomes a matter of what you can perceive of, or what you a quarry worker is not expected to work to the precision of a tool maker or a machinist. They don't work to those kind of tolerances. And so if you're going to ask a quarry worker if they could build the Great Pyramid, and them not having, the background in precision that a manufacturer would have, they'd probably tell you no. Now, there are other technologies involved too, and there are architects that would tell you no, we could not build the Great Pyramid today.
Wow.
But
so
I think it's a matter of
effort.
Yeah, it's a matter of what you can conceive of doing. I think there are technologies that we would probably have to reinvent, in order to complete the task in a reasonable amount of time, and that is how we go about lifting monolithic blocks of stone. Geometry that I demonstrate in my book are absolutely amazed that they're dumbfounded that the ancient Egyptians could do it.
Right.
And so ultimately it comes down to really, really hard evidence and proof that the ancient Egyptians were much more advanced than what we give them credit for. That the simple tools that are found in the ancient Egyptian toolbox, as described by Egyptologists, are woefully inadequate to explain the artifacts. Woefully inadequate. They just don't even come close.
Now, before we get into a lot of these details here, I really want to give the listeners, a sense of your background and what makes you kind of like, an expert in this type of stuff. So, I mean, you spent for the past 49 years, like you told me in your biography, you've been, spent, doing this high-tech manufacturing stuff. What made you, go from that technical field to studying the pyramids?
Well, I really didn't leave my technical field in studying the pyramids. I took it along with me.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's actually the foundation for my point of view is actually my background, and really many hours spent working with hand tools and also working with machinery, and understanding the difference between the two of what it actually takes to create something by hand, and what the results and finishes, and what it takes to produce something by machine. So really, I did not leave my background and just switch gears. It seemed like it was a natural transition or a natural field of study, and I started studying this the ancient Egypt after I picked up a wonderful other machine, only on a scale of acres, and that to me was absolutely incredible. And some of the tolerances that were described, such as, I'll give you an example.
Please.
There is the descending passage, a passageway in the Great Pyramid that goes down to a bedrock chamber. Over 150 feet of the constructed portion was measured, and it was found to be within 20 thousandths of an inch of being absolutely straight. And 20 thousandths of an inch, for those who are not familiar with dimension and of that nature, it's the thickness of a thumbnail.
Wow. I mean, I'm thinking this is like a really wide thing, and you're like, no, that's how close they were. Wow.
Yeah, and so it was that straight, and then over the entire constructed and also excavated passageway, 350 feet long. It was within 1/4 of an inch of being absolutely straight. So over 200 feet, we find the error, the greater error. But that's where they were actually digging out the bedrock, and even that is an incredible feat. So those things really jumped out at me and got my attention. And then, of course, studying the design of the Great Pyramid, the internal features are very unique, as you know. You have a downward passage at a 23.5-degree angle, and then you have an ascending passage on the same angle, only going up rather than descending down. And then these passageways, supposedly, according to Egyptologists, led to
how he went from being this very technical man to being so interested in the Giza pyramid, and he's going to tell us all about it. Christopher, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello. Welcome to P101.
Oh, nice to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very nice introduction.
Absolutely. Now, Christopher, not only did you write this book, but you have another book coming out very soon as well, right?
Yes, actually, it went to the printers on Friday. So I'm very, very excited about that. It's entitled Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, Advanced Engineering in the Pyramids and Temples of the Pharaohs. Ooh. And this book picks up on a subject in the Giza power plant that I consider to be the underpinning of considering the ancient Egyptians as being more than just simple folks who use simple tools to create their marvelous structures, artifacts, and particularly the statues, the Ramses statues and the statue of Akhenaten, Amenhotep, many other absolutely wonderful works of art. But this book its publication date is July 7th, and it comes 12 years after the Giza power plant was published.
Wow!
So I'm really excited about this one. It's and this book is focused strictly on the evidence. There are no unsupportable theories in the book. I don't consider the Giza power plant to be an unsupportable theory, but it still needs to be tested to some degree. But in this book, I actually go straight to the heart of the issue and argue for the brilliance of ancient Egyptian engineers and what they were able to accomplish thousands of years ago, when they were only supposed to have had simple copper tools. They were cutting or shaping granite using stone chisels or stone balls, wooden hammers, and really, really crude instruments.
Right.
And so, and it's accompanied with some marvelous photography.
Excellent.
That
I'm really jealous.
I started to key in on the precision of some of the artifacts in Egypt, particularly the precision of the Ramses statue. Now, you wouldn't think, because when you travel to Egypt, or if you go to a museum and you walk past a statue, that statue or you are constantly in motion, so your point of view is changing constantly. My intention in photographing the statue was to actually fix the camera along the central axis of the statue, so the distribution of material was equal on both sides. And in that way, I could do a computer analysis, a CAD analysis, and take some measurements, or at least compare features one with the other. And what I found on the Ramses statue was an incredible symmetry. And this symmetry is impossible to accomplish just with the eye. I have consulted with sculptors, I've consulted with physicists, mechanical engineers, and everybody who sees this simple book by Peter Tompkins, The Secrets of the Great Pyramid. And I was browsing a bookstore one day, and this book really popped out at me. I was fascinated with it. It was beautifully illustrated. It was beautifully presented, wonderful design. And I started to read it in the shop. I didn't buy it right then because this was in 1977, and the book was $20 back then.
Right.
So, but I went back to it often enough that the shopkeeper asked me if I wanted to buy it, and so yes, okay, I'll buy it. So I got the book, took it home, and started to read it in depth. Well, surprisingly, as I was reading this book, I came across questions that had never even entered my mind in the past. And those questions were related to the origins of the Great Pyramid and the really heretical notion that perhaps it was not a tomb. And some of the arguments that were put forth in the book to argue against the tomb theory, I thought were fairly cogent, really sound. And after I'd finished reading the book, I began to have those same questions. Surely the ancient Egyptians wouldn't have built this massive edifice with such a high level of precision just to house a body. And the thing that connected with me, or resonated with me, was the precision with which the pyramid was built. And what I was faced with was a structure built in antiquity that had the precision